What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. Alright, so now we've come to the conclusion of this top 10 NBA head coaching listings. And just to do a brief and final recap, at number 10, I, of course, had Bill Fitch. At number 9, Lenny Wilkens. Number 8, Chuck Daly. Number 7, John Cundler. At number 6, I had Red Holtzman. Number 5, Jack Ramsey. At number 4, Greg Popovich. Number 3, Pat Riley. Number 2, Phil Jackson. And at number 1, I have Red Auerbach. Now, I know there's some people that said, man, it's Phil. And I think the strength of it is the 11 championships. And I can also understand a counter argument that, when people, when I say, and other people might say, look, Phil coached Jordan and Kobe and Shaq and Pippen and a lot of other all-star level players. There'll be some that are going to say, but Phil coached in a more competitive era, more teams. You can look at it like that, definitely. Or you can look at it like, possibly, with fewer teams in Red Auerbach's era, 8 to 14 teams maybe, that the Boston Celtics were playing them against stiffer competition every game. They weren't playing against a 20-win Mavericks team or a 18-win, Raptors team in the 90s or something like that. You know what I'm saying? So you could argue that they're playing against stiffer competition every day, despite that caveman narrative BS that you see disseminated from Fox Sports and ESPN. But the main reason why I switched from Phil Jackson to Red Auerbach a couple years ago is, number one, is because Red was an innovator in so many more ways. It offsets the two-ring disparity that Phil and Red have. And by the way, Red could have kept coaching. He was only, when he retired from coaching, he was only what? I'm trying to think. 48 years old? He was only 48 years old when he stopped coaching. He could have coached longer. But what he did as an innovator supersedes to me what Phil Jackson did. Number one, he really broke down racial barriers as a coach. He was the one that drafted the first black player, Chuck Cooper, in 1950. He was the one who hired the first black ever head coach in Bill Russell in 1966. He was the one who made it more acceptable in the NBA, breaking down the racist hierarchy and by the way, the racist city of Boston, by having an increasingly more black Boston Celtic team. And by 1964, they had the first starting all-black team, all-black starting five in 1964. Now, one thing I'll say about Boston Celtics, at least when Red Auerbach was at the helm, they were the most progressive team in the NBA, despite the fact that they were smack dab in a city that was known to be virulently racist. But when you win as much as they do, and were, at least at that time, you can get away with that. Another thing that Red Auerbach was a great innovator in was he introduced the fast break. Before that, you didn't see that in basketball. It was plodding, half court, almost football-like basketball, where the final scores were 79, 69. Yeah, you saw that in the early 50s. It was low-scoring affairs. 80, 73, hell, 64, 63, especially late 40s, early 50s. But basketball much improved after the introduction of the shot clock and with Red Auerbach introducing the fast break as a weapon offensively. And Red Auerbach helped to bring to the game, with Frank Ramsey, the sixth man. The potent player that could be a starter coming off the bench to lead the second unit and to help keep leads. Or even enhance leads when the other team's second unit is in. These are things that Red Auerbach did as a coach. But he wasn't really liked outside of Boston because he was a shit talker. He smoked cigars after every victory. He was very combative. Probably saw a lot of pictures of him if you were growing up, a lot of images of him yelling at coaches, other coaches, yelling at officials. But he got away with it. He got away with it because of who he was and how much the Boston Celtics meant when it came to ratings and revenue with the NBA. Of course, Red Auerbach coached the Boston Celtics to 9 NBA championships, including 8 in a row from 1958 through 1966. He was the coach of the year in 1965. 11-time NBA All-Star Game head coach. I believe that's an NBA record. He's on the 25th and 35th NBA anniversary teams. Top 10 coaches in NBA history. Back in 1998, I think it was. Top 15 coach in NBA history was recent. Number 2 retired by the Boston Celtics. Now, I don't even get into what he did as an executive. But I'm just going to mention this. As an executive, he won an additional 7 championships, and he was the 1980 NBA Executive of the Year. From 1950, I believe, I'm trying to think of what the span of time was. I think from 1957 to 1986, in that 29-year span, Boston won 16 championships, which is the most successful period for any franchise in the history of the NBA. They dominated basketball. Much of it had to do with Red Auerbach. And that's why I have to put him at number 1. Red Auerbach was born in 1917 in Brooklyn, New York. His original name is Arnold Jacob Auerbach. He was one of 4 children of Marie and Hyman Auerbach. His father was a Russian Jewish immigrant from Russia, and his mother was American-born. His parents at one point in time owned a delicatessen and then later on went into the dry cleaning business. Red spent his entire childhood playing basketball. With his flaming red hair and fiery temper, Auerbach was soon nicknamed, as I said, Red. Amid the Great Depression, Red Auerbach played basketball as a guard at PS 122 and in the Eastern District High School, where he was named second team All-Brooklyn by the World Telegraph in his senior year. After a season at Seth Low Junior College, Auerbach received an athletic scholarship to the basketball program of Bill Reinhardt at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Auerbach was a standout basketball player and graduated with a M.A. in 1941. In those years, Auerbach began to understand the importance of the fast break, appreciating how potent 3 charging attackers against 2 backpedaling defenders could be. In 1940, when he was about 22 years old, Auerbach began coaching basketball at the St. Albans School and Roosevelt High School in Washington, D.C. 3 years later, he joined the U.S. Navy for 3 years, coaching the Navy basketball team in Norfolk. There, he caught the eye of Washington millionaire Mike Uihlein, who hired him to coach the Washington Capitals in the newly founded Basketball Association of America, or the BAA, a predecessor of the NBA. In the 1946-47 BAA season, Auerbach led a fast-break orientated team built around an early BAA star Bones McKinney and various ex-Navy players to a 49-11 win-loss record, including a standard-setting 17-game winning streak that stood as the single-season league record until 1969. However, they were defeated by the Chicago Stags in 6 games. The Chicago Stags, wow, man. Some of these team names, boy, they would not get away with this stuff today. The next year, the Capitals went 28-20, but were eliminated from the playoffs in a 1-game Western Division tiebreaker. In the 1948-49 BAA season, the Caps won their first 15 games and finished the season at 38-22. The team reached the BAA finals but were beaten by the Minneapolis Lakers, who were led by Hall of Fame center George Mikan. The next season, the BAA and rival league NBL merged to become the NBA. And Auerbach felt he had to rebuild his squad. However, owner Uihlein declined his proposals, and Auerbach resigned. After leaving the Capitals, Auerbach became an assistant coach of the Duke Blue Devils men's basketball team. It was assumed that Auerbach would take over for head coach Gary Gerard, who was battling cancer. During his tenure at Duke, Auerbach regularly worked with future All-American Dick Groat. Auerbach later wrote that he felt pretty bad waiting for Gerard to die and that it was no way to get a job. Auerbach left Duke after a few months when Ben Kerner, owner of the Tri-Cities Blackhawks, gave him the green light to rebuild the team from scratch. Auerbach traded more than 24 players in just 6 weeks, and the revamped Blackhawks improved, but ended the 1949-50 season with a losing record of 28-29. When Kerner traded Auerbach's favorite player, John Monken, an angry Auerbach resigned again. In 1950, Auerbach took a position as the athletic director of Kutsher's Hotel in the Catskills, New York, where Mike Tyson's from. Kutsher's was the center of a summertime basketball league, and players from the New York City area would participate, playing for one of several local country clubs and hotels. Prior to the 1950-51 NBA season, Walter Brown, owner of the Boston Celtics, was desperate to turn around his struggling and financially strapped franchise, which was reeling from a 22-46 record. Brown, in characteristic candor, said to a gathering of local Boston sports writers, "Boys, I don't know anything about basketball. Who would you recommend I hire as a coach?" The group vociferously answered that he get the recently available Auerbach, and Brown complied. In the 1950 NBA draft, Auerbach made some notable moves. First, he famously snubbed Hall of Fame New England point guard Bob Cousy in the 1950 NBA draft, infuriating the Boston crowd. He argued that the flashy Cousy lacked the poise necessary to make his team, taunting him as a local yokel. Second, he drafted African-American Chuck Cooper, the first black player to be drafted by an NBA club. With that, Auerbach effectively broke down the color barrier in professional basketball. In that year, the core of the Celtics consisted of Hall of Fame center Ed Macauley, Auerbach's old favorite McKinney, and an unlikely addition, Cousy. Cousy had refused to report to the club that had drafted him, which happened to be the Blackhawks, Auerbach's old club, and because his next team, the Chicago Stags, folded, he ended up with the Celtics. With Auerbach's fast break tactics, the Celtics achieved a 39-30 record, but lost in the 1951 NBA playoffs to the New York Knicks. However, the relationship between Auerbach and Cousy improved when the coach saw that the Houdini of the hardwood, as the spectacular dribbler and flashy passer Cousy was lovingly called, became the first great playmaker of the fledgling NBA. In the following 1951-52 NBA season, Auerbach made a remarkable draft pick of future Hall of Fame guard Bill Sharman. With the high-scoring Macaulay, elite passer Cousy, and new prodigy Sharman, Auerbach had a core that provided high-octane fast-break basketball. Other notables that would soon join the club would be forwards Frank Ramsey and Jim Lustikoff. Until 1956, the Celtics would make the playoffs every year, but never won the title. In fact, the Celtics often choked in the playoffs, going a mere 10-17 in the postseason from 1951 through 1956. As Cousy put it, we would get tired in the end and could not get the ball. As a result, Auerbach sought a defensive big man who could get easy rebounds, initiate fast breaks, and close out games. That big man, of course, would be Bill Russell. Via a draft day trade that sent Macaulay and rookie Cliff Hagan to the rival St. Louis Hawks. By that time, the Blackhawks had moved to St. Louis. He acquired Bill Russell, who was going to become one of the greatest basketball players of all time. In the same draft, Auerbach picked up forward Tom Heinsohn and guard Casey Jones, also two future Hall of Famers. Emphasizing team play rather than individual performances, and stressing that defense was more important than offense, Auerbach drilled his players to play tough defense and force opposing turnovers for easy fast break points. This is something I want to emphasize right here before I go forward. Until Michael Jordan, Red Auerbach's influence could be seen for decades because, like he said, before that you saw a lot more isolation basketball with the team's best player getting the most shots. Red Auerbach stressed team play, more something you see on the collegiate level. And that was a trend that you saw in the NBA all the way through the 1980s into the early 1990s, when it started becoming more about individual stars and whatnot. But that's another thing I wanted to bring up with Red Auerbach. Don't want to make this too long, so I'm just going to say this. The Boston Celtics, of course, won the championship in Bill Russell's rookie year. The next year, they made it to the NBA Finals to lose, I think in 7 games, I think it was 7 games, to the St. Louis Hawks. And it took a 50-point game from Bob Pettit, one of his best games ever, to edge the Celtics. And then even with that, in that series, I believe Bill Russell suffered an injury. I think he sprained his ankle or something like that. So it could have easily been 12 championships for Bill Russell and company, but they were going to win a championship the very next year in 1959. And then for 8 consecutive seasons all the way to 1966, Bill Russell and the Celtics would win titles with Red Auerbach lighting it up every year, which annoyed the hell out of his opponents. Prior to the 1965-66 NBA season, Auerbach announced the coming year would be his last as a coach, stating to the rest of the league, "This is your chance to take your last shot at me." After losing Game 1 of the 1966 NBA Finals to the Lakers, he publicly named his successor, center Bill Russell. The Celtics won the series in 7 games, sending Red Auerbach out on top. Russell then took over as player and coach, and so became the first African-American head coach ever in the 4 major North American professional team sports. While his pupil led the Celtics to 2 further titles in 1968 and 69, Auerbach rebuilt the aging Celtics with shrewd draft picks, among them future Hall of Famers Dave Cowan and JoJo White, as well as Paul Westphal and Don Chaney. With his ex-player Tom Heinsohn coaching the Celtics and led by former 6-man John Havlicek, Auerbach's new recruits won the Atlantic Division every year from 1972 and 76, winning the championship in 74 and 76. And had it not been for John Havlicek suffering that elbow injury in 1973, when they won 68 games, they probably would have won. Well, I'm not going to say probably. They very well could have won 3 titles in the 70s. Auerbach also signed veteran forward center Paul Silas and ex-ABA star Charlie Scott. The Celtics would go into a slump after Havlicek's retirement in late 1970s, but they would be renewed by the addition of Larry Bird. Now, Bird was drafted actually in 1978, but was not available to play until 1979. But Bird would become the cornerstone of a new Celtic generation, and it would win 3 titles in the 1980s, 1981, 84, and 86. In 1983, Auerbach named former Celtics player Casey Jones coach of the Celtics. Starting in 1984, Jones coached the Celtics to 4 straight appearances in the NBA Finals, winning titles in 84 and 86. Auerbach, as a part-time side gig, was the color analyst on NBA and college basketball games for TBS Sports from 1982 to 1987. In 1984, after relinquishing his general managing duties to Jan Volk, Auerbach focused on continuing as president and later vice chairman of the Boston Celtics. In a surprising move after winning their 15th title, he traded popular guard Gerald Henderson, the Game 2 hero in the finals against the Lakers, for Seattle's first-round draft pick in 1986. 2 years later, after the Celtics defeated Houston in the finals for their 16th championship, he used the second overall pick in the 86 draft to acquire Len Bias. However, we all know what happened. Len Bias died, 48 hours after he was drafted. Several years later, Reggie Lewis died. Bird's back problems began to mount, and things just pretty much just fell apart for the Boston Celtics. By the mid-1990s, I should say, Red Auerbach began to fade away from the public view and more or less sort of retired. He retired as Celtics president in 1997, as vice chairman in 2001, and he then became president, however, again, a position he held until he passed away in 2006. Although Red Auerbach in his last few years was weakened by heart problems and began to become confined to a wheelchair. Red Auerbach was honored on October 25, 2006 for his service in the Navy during World War II. It was one of his first appearances in public in many years. Just 3 days later, Red Auerbach died of a heart attack at the age of 89. Then NBA Commissioner David Stern said, the void caused by his death will never be filled. And he received many platitudes from former players and former rivals. Bird stated that Red shared our passion for the game, our commitment to excellence, and our desire to do whatever it takes to win. And Red Auerbach was also the author of several books. His first was called Basketball for the Player, the Fan, and the Coach, and it was a bestseller. His second book, which was co-authored by Paul Sand, was called Winning the Hard Way. He also wrote a pair of books with Joe Fitzgerald, Red Auerbach, an autobiography, and Red Auerbach on and off the street. His last book was called Let Me Tell You a Story, which came out in 2004. And don't really have much else to say, man. I mean, this is just a short testament to Red. There's a lot more of the things that he did and accomplished, but I do think that he is the greatest coach in the history of the NBA. And at the very least, I think he's top 2. So anyway, tell me what you guys think.